Hello friends, I hope you can see me and hear me. I hope the audio video is clear, right? So let's start the class of today's. Okay, so let's start the class of today. Today is the class, it is on the cardiac cycle. So we should be knowing about the cardiac cycle because a lot of questions are asked on this cardiac cycle, right? So first thing first is that how this cardiac cycle works and what are the phases that we are going to study. But before that, we should be knowing about one thing. So phases that we are going to learn, and first thing that we should be knowing is the about the gap junctions. There are junctions like gap junction, tight junctions, desmosome, hemidesmosomes, and all the other kinds of connection in between two cells. But this is something very important in the cardiac physiology. We say that these are the most important junctions in the cardiac physiology. Why is it so? Because these are the gap junctions. So let's learn their importance also. So this look something like this. So these are the gap junctions. So what you can see over here, there are two cell membranes. So assume that this is the one cell, okay, and this is the cell membrane of first cell membrane 1. Let's give a name like that, and this is the second cell like this, okay, and this is the second cell membrane or cell membrane of the second cell. So you can see over here, these are the gap junction between two cells. Now I told you already in the last class that these are nothing but the cardiac cell, and we know that cardiac cells are made up of, or they're nothing but a specialized type of myocytes, right? So these are the muscle cells in which they do have cell membrane, and in that cell membrane we do have gap junction. Now what are the importance of these gap junction and what they are made up of? So first of all, let's learn the functional anatomy as usual. So what you can see is that these are the gap junction. Why they're called gap junction? First thing first, you can see over here that see, this is the first junction, this is the second junction, and so on and so forth. If you do the cross section, you look or you'll see something like this under the microscope. So what are these? These are nothing but the gap junction, and you can see over here that there are 6 subunit of this particular channel. So these are made up of a protein known as connexin. So gap junction is made up of the protein known as connexin. So let's write that down. So gap junctions made up of protein, and which protein is that? That is nothing but connexin. Now 6 such connexins come together. Six such subunits will come together, and they are going to form something called as connexon. So bundle of connexin which is containing the 6 unit of connexins, they are called as connexon. So if you join 6 connecting together, right, in a circular manner, what you're going to have is the connexon. Okay, now this connexon is nothing but the gap junction. This connexon is nothing but the gap junction. Now that's why it is shown that over here you can see there are 6 subunit, and there are two positions. Either this gap junction can be open or this can be closed, right? So this you can see the closed version of gap junction, and this you can see the open gap junction. So you can see two different types of positions, either open or closed. If there is a closure of this channel, what is going to happen? No ion can pass through it. It is acting as a gate or door. So this is the pore through which the ions or different substances can move from one cell membrane to another cell membrane. So suppose I have to show you over here. Let's take this color. I hope it is visible. So you can see over here that if I have to move something from this cell to another cell, this will move through this gap junction into another side. right? And that's why they're known as gap junctions. Why they're known as gap junctions? Because they're creating the gap when they are open, right? Now one thing you can see over here, that these channel going through the one cell membrane and throughout the second cell membrane, right? So they are connecting two cell membranes, and that means that whatever ions or the substances are going through this gap junction, so ions or molecules or substances going through the gap junction, they does not, or they did not, or it does not, so they do not, let's write, they don't enter into ECF. That means they do not enter into extracellular fluid, right? So from one intracellular fluid, so suppose this is the intracellular fluid of the first membrane, this is the intracellular fluid of the second membrane, right? So these gap junctions are connecting, or they are giving the channel to them, or giving the doorway to them, so that they can enter through this interstitial fluid to another interstitial fluid, and they do not need to enter into this ECF. So point to be remember over here, because they already ask you as a reasoning and a search question in Fmge exam itself. So it is very important that if you have a VIP gateway and if you have a shortcut, obviously you'll go with a shortcut. Nobody likes the long cut, right? So yes, beautiful shortcut, if it is present, everybody likes to go with that beautiful shortcut, and this is that shortcut for the ions that they are going through the shortcut, and that shortcut name is nothing but the gap junction. That is nothing but the gap junction, right? Okay, right? So this is important, and what they allow, first thing is, the ions does not need to go into the ECF, and they're directly going from one cell ICF to another cell ICF, right? So what is happening, they are saving their time. I told you this is a shortcut, so that's why they're saving their time from going from one cell to another cell. So that's why over here the duration that they are going to require is very less, right? So what is going to happen over here, that they are saving the time. Okay, so the duration that they are required, so because of this gap junction, ions can move through or from one cell to another cell, move through cells, or we can write from one cell to another cell very quickly. Now there are thousands and thousands myocytes in the heart, right? There are many myocytes in the heart, but remember, if we talk about the atria and ventricle, they say that atria contracts at one time and ventricle contracts at another time, right? But both the ventricles contract at the same time and both the atria contract at the same time. Now, even if you take the ventricle, it is going to contain the thousands of cells, right, or thousands of myocardium. Now, to contract the ventricle at one time, it is going to require to activate all the cells at the same time, right? So this gap junction help in that property, that if you want to activate all the cells, or you want to have that ionic concentration change in all the cell at the same time, obviously you have to save the time, and that is saved via this gap junction, right? I just showed you that there are some gap junctions over here, but as you can see over here, there are many gap junction in the cardiomyocyte like this, right? Almost all the cells are connected with the gap junctions. right? So what is going to happen if one cell have that ionic change? Definitely that ionic change will be carry forwarded to another cell very quickly, बहुत jaldi se it will go into suppose sodium, because of the action potential, the sodium channel opened into this channel. Obviously that sodium not going to go out, but it is going to find a shortcut and it is going to go in the another cell, right? And because of that sodium entry, the cell also be depolarized very quickly, right? And this now the ionic changes happen into the second cell. From the second cell, the whatever sodium came, it is going to go towards the next cell, so it is going to lead to the depolarization of that cell also. So that's why it is going to cause the rapid changes in ionic concentration and helps in the activation of all the, you can say, activation of all the ventricular myocytes or the atrial myocyte at the same time, right? And that's why it is possible to ventricle to contract at the same time. So we can write that down. So because of that, ventricular muscles, or almost all ventricular muscle, they contract at almost same time. They contract at the same time, and that's why it is going to lead to what thing? A ventricular contraction at the same time. So this is known as, the heart is known as syncytium. Syncytium. That means it is going to act, all of these muscles are going to contract at the same time, and that's why what is going to happen, they are acting as a single unit. They're acting as a single unit, not a separate muscles, right? All the muscles, they act as a same unit, and that's why they are known as syncytium. This is the, you can say, the fancy word for single unit. The whole of the ventricular muscles, they act as a single unit, and that's why they are known as syncytium. That's why it is known as syncytium. Now in the heart we do have two different types of syncytium, and what are they? First is the atria, another is the ventricle, right? So all the atrial muscle fibers, they contract at the same time, and all the ventricular muscle fibers, they are going to contract at the same time. Now why it is required that atria and ventricle, they should contract at different time? Now remember that atria, first of all, atria should get filled with the venous or deoxygenated blood. Suppose we are talking about the right ventricle, and at the same time the left atrium should be filled with the oxygenated blood which is coming from the pulmonary vein, right? And then they should fill the ventricles, and ventricle will contract towards the aorta or pulmonary artery. So that's why this cycle can be maintained. If the atria as well as ventricle contract at the same time, definitely there will be a lot of chaos. The blood will not be able to go anywhere, right? Because suppose this is the atria, this is the ventricle. The atria and ventricle, if they contract at both the times, the valve, the AV valves, they will rupture, right? Because a lot of pressure from the both the side, right? And ventricles, they are bigger than the atria, and that's why what is going to happen, if you contract them both the time at the same time, both of them will contract, then that is going to create a lot of problem. What problem? First of all, the blood should always come from the atria towards the ventricle, right? But if we contract both of them at the same time, what is going to happen? The ventricle, they do have the more power to contract and create more pressure, right? And they are going to create more pressure, and that's why the blood is going to flow from the ventricle towards the atria, right? And that is known as regurgitation. So we can write that down. So if normally the blood should flow from atrium to ventricle, but if blood goes into opposite direction, that is from ventricle towards the atria, this is abnormal condition. This is abnormal condition, and this is known as regurgitation. This is known as regurgitation. You must have heard of aortic regurgitation, mitral regurgitation, the semilunar valve regurgitation. Regurgitation means going in the opposite direction, going in the opposite direction, right? So this is the basics, right? I told you that first the atria should contract and it should fill the ventricle, then ventricle should contract once it is filled, and what should happen? Then the blood should move into either aorta or pulmonary arteries. So I'll write just the corresponding arteries, or corresponding, we can write outlet, corresponding outlet, right? Okay, so I just wanted to show you one video which I'm unable to download. So here it is. So what you can see is that see over here the atria is contracting first, right? I hope so over here the atria is contracting first. Okay, so over here the atria is contracting first. See, blood came here and then it is going into pulmonary artery, right? From here what is going to happen? It is going to go in the lungs. It is going to come towards the left atrium. You can see over here it is came here, then ventricle will contract and it is going to go in the aorta. One more thing you notice over here, that atria is contracting at first, and at that time the ventricles are relaxed, and when the ventricles are contracting the atrias are relaxed, right? So that's how it works. They do not open at same time. And when notice these two valves, that whenever the atrioventricular valve is open, the mitral valve should be closed, and whenever this valve is open, this valve should be closed. So both of the AV valve, that means either the right ventricular valve, that is the tricuspid valve, or mitral valve, they open at the same time. But remember, whenever the AV valve opens, the semilunar valve, that these two valves should be closed, right? And vice versa, when these are opening, these valves should be closed. So one way direction movement should occur, right? So at a time, either atrioventricular valves, that is AV valve, or your semilunar valve. I'll just write SL valve. So what is AV valve? That is nothing but atrioventricular valve, and SL valve is semilunar valves. Okay, atrioventricular valve and semilunar valve. Okay, either the AV valve or SL valve will open at a time. Both will not. If both open at the same time, that's the pathology or disease. That's not normal. This is the pathology or disease. So first rule is that either at a time atria will contract, or or the ventricle will contract. Both cannot contract at the same time. That's the first rule. Second rule, according to that, their valve will also behave. That either the AV valve will open, and when they are going to open, whenever the atria will contract. So we can write that down. Whenever the atria will contract. So we can write that whenever we say atria is contracting, there is a word term known as atrial contraction. So whenever the atrial contraction is going to take place, definitely the atrioventricular valve will open, right? And what about the SL valve? Whenever the ventricles are going to contract, so we can write ventricular contraction. At that time, the SL valve will open. So makes sense. First rule, one thing will contract at a time, that means either atria or ventricle, right? But both the atria will contract at the same time and both the ventricles at contract at the same time. That means left and right ventricle contract at the same time, but the right atrium and right ventricle, they are not going to contract at the same time, right? Both ventricles contract at the same time, both atria contract at the same time, but the atria and ventricle, they contract at different time, right? And according to them, whenever they are contracting, the AV valve or the SL valve is going to get open up, right? And that's how the cycle works, and that's how the cycle take place, and thus is known as the cardiac cycle, right? So if you see in the books, this type of diagram will be given to you. Just I want you to notice over here that where it is written the atrial contraction and ventricular contraction. So what you can see over here is that the atria and ventricles are contracting at different time. Okay, now there is a terminology for that. This is, we call it as, whenever something is contracting in the heart, we call it as systole. Either atria or ventricle, we use the term systole, right? And whenever anything is relaxing, we use the term diastole. Okay, so there are two terms, write that down, systole or diastole. So what we use, the term systole or diastole. Systole means something is contracting, diastole means something is relaxing. Now, what do you mean by that something? Either if the atria is contracting or ventricle are contracting, we call it as atrial systole or ventricular systole. Okay, and if they are relaxing, we call it as atrial diastole. And ventriculars, if they are relaxing, we call them as ventricular diastole. Okay, so these terminology we are going to use. We are not going to say every time that they are contracting, they are relaxing. Whenever I am going to use the term systole, that you have to understand that I am talking about the contraction, and when I am going to use the term diastole, you have to remember that I am meaning that these muscles are relaxing. That particular group of muscle, either atria or ventricles, they are relaxing. Cool. So that's how the atrial cycle looks like. It is very complicated, but let's make it simple so that whatever type of question comes on this concept, you should be very thorough with this cardiac cycle phases. Now, whenever something is happening, you have to remember, either they will ask you in terms of pressure changes or volume changes. Pressure changes or volume changes, right? First of all, whenever you talk about these pressure changes or volume changes, what you have to know is, first there will be change in the pressure, and then there will be change in the volume. So first pressure changes will take place, and then the volume changes are going to take place. Whenever the pressure changes are going to take place, at that time the volume will be same. So let's write that down. So whenever So let's write that. So in cardiac cycle, the pressure changes, the pressure changes, they, they occur first, and then the volume changes. Right, so what happens first? The pressure changes occurs first, and then the volume changes. Now during the pressure change, what happens to the volume? Then that will be same. So that means during the time when pressure changes take place, what happens at that time to the volume? The volume will be same, the volume will remain same, and that is known as and if something we call it as same, the terminology we use is iso. So iso volumetric change. So usually when the pressure changes, we talk about contraction. So whenever the contraction is going on, that means suppose we talk about the ventricular contraction. So ventricle try to overcome the pressure in the aorta, right? And then only the door is going to open. Suppose there is a door, right? Someone is pushing from here and someone is pushing from here, right? So if I push harder from this side, this is going to open up, right? If I push from that side, this is not going to open up. So some you can say bodyguard is standing there, so you have to push harder than the you can say pressure applied or force applied by that bodyguard from the opposite side, right? So what you need to do is you have to push that door very you can say with the larger force, or the amount of force should be higher than that of the other side. Similar doors are present in the heart also, and what they are known as, we know they are known as valves, right? So if suppose we talk about the ventricle, suppose this is the atria and this is the ventricle. Okay, here we are going to have those valve. Okay, we are going to have those valve. Give me a minute. Okay, so suppose this is the ventricle, this is the atria, and we are going to have this valve over here, right? Suppose we are talking about the left atrium and left ventricle. So we are going to have the aortic valve over here, aorta. So that's why over here what we are going to have is the aortic valve. Now what happens over here is that, so aortic valve, this valve is usually closed. This is the entrance, so that the left ventricle blood that should go in this aorta. But what happens is there is some amount of pressure from this aorta also, and how much it is? It is around say 119 mmHg. So to open up these, you can say the or 120, we will say 120 or 119. So what is going to happen if you have to open these doors up from here? You have to apply at least 120 mmHg of force, at least 120 mm of Hg of force, at least 1 mm of Hg of force more than this aorta. Then only what is going to happen? Then only this aorta or aortic valve is going to be open up, right? Unless and otherwise you apply more than 119 force, that is at least you should not you apply the 120 mm of Hg force, the doors will not open, right? So that's the funda behind the understanding of valves and their openings, right? So whenever we say that the suppose this first of all we know that what is the pressure in the heart, right? So let's draw that again. So suppose I'll just draw a simple one. Okay, this is the ventricle, this is the uh, atria, and this is your artery, right? So what is going to happen is that suppose in the diastole we have zero pressure over here, 0 mm, almost 0 mm Hg pressure. Now as the blood started to fill from here, this pressure is going to increase, right? Dhire dhire, slowly, steadily, gradually this pressure start to increase, right? After filling, some 10 mmHg of pressure is there. Still we know that over here in the aorta there is 119 or 120 mmHg of pressure is there. We have to exceed that pressure. So after once this atrial contraction is over, this is going to close the valve, this is going to close its own door, right? So now suppose this is the valve, this will be closed, right? There is no more filling. Now what is going to happen, the ventricle, as the myocardium get the action potential, they start to contract, and when they start to contract, what is going to happen, the pressure is going to get built up, right? And slowly and steadily this pressure will still rise, right? Suppose say it became 80, then 100, right? And it also became 120. But at this time what is happening to volume, both the channels are closed during this phase of ventricular contraction. That means the AV valve is also closed, the semilunar valve is also closed, so both valves are closed. So the blood is not moving anywhere, blood from the ventricle is not moving anywhere, so no changes in blood volume, no changes in blood volume, and that's why it is known as the volume will be same, volume will remain same, pressure is changing but volume will remain the same. And you know that this kind of thing is known as isovolumetric, right? So this is known as isovolumetric contraction. Since the contraction is going on and at this point still the valves are not open, so what is happening over here, the contraction is going on but the volume is the same, and that's why it is known as the isovolumetric contraction, and that's why it is known as isovolumetric contraction, right? So this is called as isovolumetric contraction. Fine. Now after some time this is going to be 121 mmHg. As soon as the ventricle does not give up the hope, it is still contracting, right? And it is at some point it is going to exceed this 120 mm of Hg. As soon as it becomes 121, what is going to happen, these semilunar valve will open. As soon as this exceed this 120 mm of Hg pressure, these valves will open up like this, right? And blood start to flow from the ventricle in the you can say corresponding artery. Suppose if we are talking about left ventricle, then obviously the aorta, right? So this is going to happen, and this phase when the ventricles are contracting, once the after this isovolumetric contraction, ventricular pressure will be more than uh, their pressure in the arteries, pressure in the corresponding arteries, let's write pressure in the corresponding arteries, and because of that the sublunnar valve will open, right? And as soon as it is open, already the pressure in the ventricles are very high. Definitely the blood flows from high pressure to low pressure, so that's why the blood will flow in this corresponding artery. Blood will flow in the corresponding arteries. Now the volume will change. Definitely the blood is moving, and that's why the volume changes are going to occur. So hence it is proof that first of all the pressure changes will occur, right? But the volume will remain same, and then the volume is going to change, right? So then corresponding artery and volume changes occur. Volume changes occur, right? So this is the phase when we say that ventricle either contracting or atria contracting depending on what pressure change, what volume changes are occurring. So in this topic we talked about the ventricular contraction, and this phase is known as systolic. So whenever I did not mention either which systole is this, either it is atrial systole or ventricular systole. Remember, whenever it is not mentioned that it is atrial systole, that means it is ventricular systole. No matter what, the ventricular systole is written as a ventricular systole or simply systole, right? So that means even if you do not write ventricular, it is okay. It is understood that this is nothing but the ventricular systole. Ventricular systole. This is the automatic, you can say the saying that we do not have to mention the ventricular word in front of the systole. It is understood that if someone just said that it is the systole, that means it is the ventricular systole. Okay. Now, this is also known as when the volume changes occur, that means the blood flow from the ventricular chamber or ventricles to corresponding artery. This type of thing is known as ejection. Ejection, simply the ejection or ventricular ejection. Now, what do you mean by ejection? Ejection means something is exiting out. Okay, something is going out. Something is ejecting means if you take a pipeline and forcefully if you release the water from that pipeline, something is that water is ejecting out of the pipeline, we say that. So similarly, the blood flow is also, or the blood volume is also ejecting from the ventricles into the arteries, and that's why we say it as ejection. So anything word comes as the systole or the ejection, that means the ventricle systole and ejection that happens after the once the pressure changes have been taken place, right? So what we talk about, once the first of all what is going to happen in the ventricle, as soon as the atria filled up the ventricle, the ventricular valve will be closed, the ventricular valve will be closed, or the AV valve rather say it is closed. Then which valve will open once the contraction started? The phase will come when the both valve will was closed. So this is known as, when both valve closed, known as isovolumetric contraction. Then as soon as this pressure in the ventricle it exceeds the corresponding artery, these valves will be open. These valves will be open, right? These particular valves, they will be open like this, and the blood start ejecting out. So the ejection, the volume changes are going to happen. Remember, the volume changes happens in the two phases. First of all, due to such high pressure, what is going to happen? Some blood will be flowing very very rapidly, and that rapid flow is nothing but your rapid ejection. I told you that whenever the blood is going to eject out from the ventricle into the corresponding artery, we say it as ejection. So that is nothing but rapid ejection. And after some time, what is going to happen is that due to this rapid ejection, what happened is, due to this rapid ejection, the blood went into this uh, arteries, right? After that, the ventricle will be still in the same position, but some volume is already lost. So the pressure start to come down, but at that time, due to some momentum, or you can say as momentum. What do you mean by momentum? It is a physics law. So suppose if you are going in a car or you are going in a bus, right? You apply the brake to the car, but your body moves forward. So that means your body also acquire the speed in which the car was. So your body is in the momentum and it just goes forward somewhat. Okay. So similarly, the blood also when the heart started to contract, it came into the momentum, right? It gained that speed so that to come go out, and that's will give the later on ejection, that after the once the ventricle is fully contracted, still the blood is going to move out. Why? Because there is some momentum, and that is nothing but slow ejection. Okay, obviously the no more pressure changes are occurring, so that's why this process will be bit slower, or you can say early ejection and late ejection. This is active process because the heart muscles are contracting, and this one is the passive process, right? So if somebody give you the question in the exam, what is the rapid ejection, what is the early ejection, or what is the active ejection, all three means the same, that first 2/3 volume of the blood ejecting out as soon as the semilunar valves are open, that is nothing but rapid ejection, early ejection, or active ejection, right? And remaining 1/3 volume also moves because of the you can say momentum, right? That is gained by the contraction of the ventricle, right? And first was is due to ventricular contraction. So obviously the contraction, whenever it occurs, that means muscles are contracting, and you know that the muscular contraction is always and always active. So if somebody asks you what is the slow ejection, late ejection, or passive ejection, you have the answer that after the early ejection, that is once the 2/3 blood is gone, the remaining 1/3 volume of the blood flows due to the momentum that is gained during the ventricular contraction, and that is nothing but your slow ejection, late ejection, and passive ejection. These three means the same, that whatever 1/3 amount of the blood when goes in the late phase of the ejection, that is nothing but called as slow ejection, late ejection, and passive ejection. Now this is about the ventricles, right, and their semilunar valves and corresponding arteries. what happens, how the blood comes into atria, and what happens, how the atria throws the blood into the ventricle, they also has a same manner changes. But we are talking in terms of atria now. So whenever the atria contracts, the ventricle must be relaxing, because the I told you that when atria contracts, atria ventricle relax, when ventricle contracts, atria relax. This process is going on, right? So both does not contract at the same time. That's the difference. So atria, whenever the atria contracts, ventricle relaxes. Whenever the atria contracts, the ventricle relaxes. What is the procedure that is going to happen in the atria? I told you, when we talk just about the systole or just about the diastole, it is nothing but we are talking about the ventricular. About the ventricular systole just right now, that how the pressure start to build first, that is known as isovolumetric contraction. Volume does not change, right? So that's why it is known as isovolumetric contraction. And later on, once the pressure changes are over, the ventricle overcomes the pressure of the corresponding artery, and whatever volume changes are going to happen, that is known as systole or ejection, right? So volume, first of all, pressure change, isovolumetric. Let's complete it down. So what are the three phases of systole? If you, I have to write three phases of systole, I'll write like this. Suppose there is a line, you have to divide into three. Early systole, or you can say, first of all, you'll say isovolumetric contraction, right? This is nothing but early systole, right? Mid systole, early systole, mid systole, and late systole. And the mid systole is nothing but early ejection phase, early ejection, rapid ejection, or the active ejection, that is 2/3 of the blood will eject out, right? And what is the late systole? It is nothing but your slow or late ejection, and that happens 1/3. That only amount is the 1/3. First of all, 2/3 early ejection and 1/3 late ejection, right? So this is about the systole. The same way we have to make a graph or chart of diastole also, right? So what about the diastole? Let's learn that quickly. Once you understand this funda of the systole, the diastole will be very easy. Now we know that ventricles must be relaxing at some point, and as I told you, once the ventricles start to relax, at the same time, suppose this is the atria. Now we are going to talk in terms of atria and ventricle, not the semilunar valves. Now what happens over here, that corresponding vein, so suppose if we are talking about right atrium, the inferior and superior vena cava, they're going to drain into this right atrium, they are going to drain into this right atrium, right? At that moment this valve should be closed, right? Otherwise it is going to go directly into the ventricle, which we should not allow, right? First of all, it is going to come to a chamber and then to the second chamber, right? And that's how the cycle is going to take place. But these changes that we are discussing, they're very quick, and that's why it is in milliseconds, not even in the seconds, they are in milliseconds. So look as if the continuous blood flow is going on, there is no stoppage in between, okay? But these changes does take place in milliseconds. So as the blood is coming here, this valve, that is the AV valve, should be closed, right? And when the ventricles are contracting, at that time the AV valve is closed, right? What happens is blood started to fill over here. As it started to fill over there, what is going to happen? There will be increase in the pressure, right? When the atria was empty, atria was empty, it had less pressure in the atria than the ventricle. So this is, suppose this is the ventricle. So this is the ventricle. In that ventricle, the pressure was higher, right? As soon as it emptied into the ventricle, it was empty. The pressure falls, right? And the valve closes. This AV valve closes, right? And the ventricular contraction starts. Now, the ventricles, once they ejected the blood out, now the ventricles will be empty. And till that time, when they were ejecting the blood, what happened is, at the same time, the inferior and superior vena cava filled up the right atrium. So right atrium will be filled, or atria will be filled, and because of that the pressure is going to go higher. But since the ventricles are contracting at that time, the pressure inside this ventricle must be more than the atria, right? As soon as what happens, as soon as the pressure inside the atria because of this filling go up, and once the ejection phase is over, what is going to happen? The pressure inside the ventricles will be empty, and the pressure inside the ventricle is going to fall, right? So here decrease in the pressure will occur, and the ventricles start to relax, right? At the time, over here, what is going to happen? The valve will close. As I told you that if the corresponding arteries are having more pressure, the valves will be closed. The semilunar valve will be open only and only when the ventricular pressure is much more than their corresponding arteries, right? So they are closed now, right? And this ventricles start to relax, right? As it is starting to relax and diastole, the pressure further falls, right? And during the same time, the inferior vena cava and superior vena cava, they are filling up the right atrium. As soon as the pressure goes up more than, whenever it is going to be more than this ventricular pressure, so what is going to happen? These valves will be open. So these AV valves will be open. So the valve, as soon as the pressure goes beyond the ventricular pressure, the valves are going to open, and the blood from the right atria, it is going to move into the right ventricle, right? Very, very easy. First of all, again the same thing happened over here. First of all, the pressure changes, and then the volume changes. Whenever the atria start contracting, the same thing is going to happen. At that time, the ventricle was relaxed. The ventricle, we talked about the ventricle started to relax at the same time when there is the closure of these. Both the valves were closed, right? Both the valves were closed. So, what happened over here? So, let's write that down. So, whenever, suppose this was the ventricle, okay, so this was the ventricle, it was in the contracted state. Later on it start to relax. Later on it start to relax. What is going to happen? The pressure is going to fall into this. There will be decrease in the pressure, right? And decrease in the pressure, because of that this valve is open. So before opening of this valve, that means when the pressure of the RA was more, both the valve will close. As soon as this semilunar valve will close, as soon as the pressure inside this ventricle is start to decrease, right? So semilunar valve will close, and at that time these valve, AV valve, will open once the pressure, or you can say both the valves are closed right now. Then the ventricle started to relax, right? The pressure further falls until and unless this pressure become less than the atria, it is going to relax. As soon as the atria becomes higher pressure, these valves will be open, AV valves will be open, and the blood start to come down. When both the valves were closed, so first of all, what happened in the diastole? That means we are talking about ventricular diastole, right? First of all, the ventricles after emptying into corresponding arteries, they start to have low pressures and they start to relax. We can write they start to relax, and this relaxation will lead to decrease in the pressure. This relaxation is going to decrease in the pressure, right? And because of this decrease in the ventricular pressure will whenever at this point both the at this time both the AV valve and SL valve, they are closed. AV and SL valve both are closed, right? As soon as, and this, as I told you, the pressure decreases there. If both the valves are closed, definitely no movement of, you can say, blood from the ventricle or no movement of blood into the ventricle. So ventricular volume will be the same, and this is known as isovolumetric relaxation. Isovolumetric relaxation. Now, the diastole that we are talking about over here, so that means in the diastole what happens? The ventricle start to relax. In the diastole, the ventricle start to relax, and that's why there are no changes in the volume, just the pressure changes are occurring. That means the pressure is going to go down, right? But there is no volume change. There is no whatsoever volume change, and that's why this is known as isovolumetric phase, and that is nothing but over here we are talking about diastole. The ventricle is relaxing, and that's why it is known as isovolumetric relaxation. Isovolumetric relaxation. Now, as I told you, the ventricular pressure started to fall down, but the atrial pressure is increasing, right? The point will come whenever the atrial pressure will be more than the ventricular pressure. Atrial pressure will be more than the ventricular pressure, and that will lead to the opening of that will lead to opening of the AV valve. Just give me 2 minutes, I'm finishing the blood. So opening of the AV valve, that is the atrioventricular valve, right? And once the AV valves are opened, what is going to happen is that the AV valve are open, the blood will flow from the atria into the ventricle. Atria into the ventricle, right? And that is known as the diastole, or that is known as the filling phase. So remember, the atria is throwing out the blood into the ventricle. So ventricles are filling up with the blood. Atria is filling, ventricles are filling up with the blood. So this phase is known as the filling phase. This phase is known as the filling phase. Now remember, in the filling, we do have early filling and late filling, right? We do have early filling and late filling. Again, the early filling will be of two-third filling. That means two-third of the blood, due to the gravity, is going to come, and that is known as early filling. The late filling is one-third filling. That is due to strong atrial contraction, right? So that is known as late filling. So there are two phases, early filling and late filling. So if we have to summarize the diastole as we did the systole, so we have three different phases, that is diastole, again early diastole, mid diastole, or late diastole. Early diastole, mid diastole, and late diastole. This early diastole, I told you there is no volume change, so that's why this is nothing but the isovolumetric change, or isovolumetric filling we can say, or isovolumetric diastole, or isovolumetric, just say relaxation. This is the early filling, which is very rapid. So early or rapid filling, that is two-third of the blood. The atria throw the two-third of the blood into the ventricle. The late one, late diastole, is late or slow filling, because you can say it is because just of the atrial contraction, so remaining blood is going to go out, so it is bit of a slow filling, one-third filling, right? So this is about the systole and diastole. If you have any doubt, you can ask, right? So if we see the systole and diastole, they quite look similar, right? So over here the systole is there. Again, first phase was isovolumetric, right? In the diastole also, first phase is isovolumetric. That means the volume will be same, only what is going to change? The pressure is going to change, right? So first change will be isovolumetric, that means pressure change, and the second will be either the ejection in the systole or the filling in the diastole, right? That's how we can sum up everything, right? So we can divide that into two phases or three phases. Ejection and filling are divided into either early and late, and over here also it is early and late, right? So that's all for the today's class. Let's meet in the next session, right?